Good afternoon. I'm David Luberoff, the Center's Deputy Director, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's talk by Mel Miller and Sharon Welch, the Center's current Gramlich Fellows in Community and Economic Development. Before I introduce them in today's session, I have a few announcements. On Tuesday, February 8th, that's next Tuesday, at 6:30 p.m. in GSD's Piper Auditorium, HUD Secretary Marcia Fudge will give the Center's 21st Annual John T. Dunlop Lecture. This will be a hybrid event, which means it will be our first in-person event in almost 2 years. We are very excited. However, the in-person session is open only to people with a Harvard ID. Everyone else and Harvard affiliates who don't want to be there in person can attend online. Hopefully we'll be able to allow non-Harvard people to come to in-person events in the not too distant future. On February 11th, Friday at 2:30 p.m., the Center will host an online information session about our summer fellowships and research opportunities, including the Gramlich Fellowship. This is open only to Harvard graduate students who are planning on returning to school in the fall. And on Friday, February 18th, the Housing Research Seminar will continue with a talk by Jennifer Malinsky, Project Director for the Center's new Housing in an Aging Society program. Jen will be speaking about a new paper examining the demographic characteristics of residents who have challenges entering, navigating, and using their homes. You can find more information about these and other Center events and get copies of our blog and forthcoming and papers on our website. Now, on to today's presentation. As I noted, both Mel and Sharon are Gramlich Fellows. Each year, this fellowship, which has been funded by NeighborWorks America since 1999, gives two students unique opportunities to learn how leading practitioners are working to address important housing-related challenges. Gramlich Fellows present their work to interested practitioners, policymakers, civic leaders, and researchers. They prepare a working paper that's issued jointly by the Center and NeighborWorks America. Our website has more information, including instructions on how to apply for the 2022 Gramlich Fellowship, an application that I note is due on Monday, February 14th. Excuse me. Though they spend only 10 weeks carrying out the bulk of their research, Gramlich Fellows almost always produce interesting, novel, and notable work. And as you're about to hear, this year is no exception. We'll start with a presentation by Mel Miller, a second-year student in urban planning at GSD. Mel spent the summer examining how the managers and owners of nonprofit housing developments fund and administer a variety of resident service programs. Mel will speak for about 15 minutes, and then she'll take questions for about 5 to 10 minutes. You can submit questions using Zoom's Q&A feature, and we will curate them to make sure we get to the ones that seem most pressing and important. Apologies in advance if we don't get to your question. Then we'll hear from Sharon Welch, a second-year student in GSD's programs in both architecture and design studies. Sharon will discuss her research on the role of design in creating new, affordable housing in Native American communities in the Southwestern United States. She'll also take questions, and if there's time, Mel may join us for some final questions. And somehow, we're going to do all of that and finish by about 1:15 p.m. Both talks, as well as both slide decks, will be available on the Center's website. Mel, it's all yours.
Thank you, David. And I'm all set on my slides.
Yep.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see the numbers all here today and speak a little bit about my research from this summer. As David mentioned, that focuses on the funding and delivery models among affordable housing nonprofits within the NeighborWorks network. I'll start with an overview of my research, and then I'll go over findings before ending with a discussion of key takeaways, along with some conclusions and recommendations for future research. So first, in terms of my research, my work this summer really centered around 3 main research questions, all addressed specifically for affordable housing nonprofits that own or manage rental housing within the NeighborWorks network. The first being, what are these services offered by affordable housing nonprofits? Second, how are these services funded? And then lastly, how are they delivered? And I'll just note that in order to really answer these questions, I first aligned my own data collection efforts with NeighborWorks' own work, especially their 2020 annual survey that covers from October 2019 to September 2020. And doing so really provided this operational definition of resident services that I frame my research around, specifically seeing resident services as a property-based program where services are provided to residents either on-site or through referrals. So in terms of my own data collection efforts, I started this summer with pre-survey interviews to both understand the field of resident services, but then eventually to pilot test the survey. Early on, it was decided that a survey would be able to both provide as broad, but also as comprehensive understanding of the questions that I sought to address. And then during this roughly 1 month period in the middle of the summer, I launched the survey with an email to 185 organizations. And of those, I received 74 responses for these affordable housing nonprofits that own or manage the rental housing. And then towards the end of the summer, really following the launch of the survey, and once responses started to come in, I began speaking with organizations and experts in the field in general in order to both expand upon certain responses, but also just learn about the field of services in general. So in terms of diving into the findings from the survey, what you see here is a format that pretty much aligns closely with the format of the survey, and then also with those 3 research questions I shared earlier. I want to just also note that respondents were asked to report on resident services for fiscal year 2020 in order to align with that same time period from the annual survey that I shared earlier. And although I think it goes without saying at this point, of course, I think it's important to recognize that the period from October 2019 to September 2020 was an unusual time for resident services and affordable housing nonprofits in general. So first, in terms of focusing on services offered by area and property type, I want to note that 41 of the 74 respondents, or just over half, offer resident services to their entire portfolio, with an average across respondents offering services to 80% of their properties. So across the board, most organizations are offering services to either all or nearly all of their properties. In terms of the service area where organizations are working in, as we see here, the most popular areas are those of eviction prevention, followed by health and well-being services, and then food security services, with fewer organizations working in the areas of long-term of tax preparation and workforce development. And then in terms of while I only really, by asking about these service areas, it allowed me to first understand, okay, well, what are organizations working in? But then in terms of asking about budgets and funding sources, being able to tease out further how their overall budgets change and evolve based on the service area themselves. Another benefit was also being able to sort of lessen the burden of this survey and being able to tie it to the annual survey to understand, okay, of the 1 out of 4 organizations that are working in child development service and strategies, we know from that previous work that they're working in areas such as childcare, preschool development screenings, family-based early childhood literacy, home visiting, parent leadership and support, and the like. So shifting over to service, to the budgets and funding sources themselves, again, I asked about overall budgets and funding and then by service area. That said, for today's presentation, I'm just going to focus on the overall budgets and funding. When we look at the total budgets for resident services, there's this huge range, right? Anywhere from $2,500 all the way up to $17.2 million. That said, I think that the concentration of organizations in these left 2 buckets show that most organizations who took the survey have a resident services budget less than $500,000, which is further supported by the median, which came at just over $280,000. And in terms of funding sources, we also see a diversity of sources across and then within organizations. And before I dive into a few of the sources we see here, just to orient you to this tree map, it's pretty much functioning as a pie chart would. So all of these sources add up to 100%. So with the average being across organizations. So for example, 30% of resident services across all organizations are funded through the property operating budget. That said, I'm just going to highlight the top 3 sources to sort of illustrate additional details. In terms of the property operating budget, it's not only the greatest average among organizations, but it was also reported by the most organizations, fueling 48 organizations' budgets. And among those who are using property operating budget to fund their resident services, they're utilizing this to fund 47% of their resident services budgets on average. Government funding was reported by 37 organizations, with those reporting this source using government funding to source 37% of their budgets on average. And I just want to note that the survey didn't ask about specific funds from government nor foundation funding and the like. That said, I think that other questions on the survey, and especially the follow-up interviews, really did color what type of funding was coming in this area. So for example, within government funding itself, we see a really wide range with funding coming from anywhere from entities like USDA to departments of health and education within various states to statewide partnerships like Vermont's SASH program that I'll hopefully have time to go over in a little bit. And then lastly, foundation funding was reported by 42 organizations. And for these organizations that utilize foundation funding, it makes up 26% of their budgets on average. So then lastly, I'll focus on delivery of resident services in terms of the survey. And I'll say that I knew from the beginning of at the beginning of the summer that this was going to be an essential part for organizations. Early on, I think it was one of the first interviews where I spoke with an organization, someone shared with me that they couldn't do what they do without a partner organization. And I think that sentiment is completely mirrored here, with really the one exception being eviction prevention, where we see that 71% of organizations are delivering this work themselves. The survey also provides a lot of insight into what exactly these partnerships look like. And while I won't have time to go into each service area and what the partnerships are, I just want to highlight the health and well-being services, which I think illustrates both how partnerships are used and the diversity of partnerships within each service area. So in terms of looking at health and well-being services, where we see that 72% partnerships in this area include hosting clinics on site on a monthly basis, partnering with local government and hospitals to offer COVID testing and vaccinations, and hosting a Men of Color health and wellness peer support group that partners with local health centers to provide educational programming regarding physical and mental health. So then just shifting over to some key takeaways. The first thing I'll say is that while the survey didn't explicitly ask about the pandemic, I think its impacts were seen in certain text field responses, and then especially in follow-up interviews. One I want to highlight in particular is when I spoke with an organization based in the Southern Vermont region, who at the time of taking the survey, they were only offering services to 22% of their properties. Throughout the pandemic, though, they saw both flexibility in their budget along with new sources of funding available that hadn't been available previously. And so what they were able to do is first hire additional staff and then bring services across their entire portfolio. And so as you see here in the quote, the executive director shared that they realized how amplified a lot of the challenges were in their community and how little capacity our partner agencies had to respond to the needs of their residents. And so while I think that Windham and Windsor Housing Trust was able to sort of figure out how to rise up and meet that need, it sort of lends me to my next point, which is that there's this need to establish stable, consistent funding for services. I think an organization that really illustrated that for me was RUPCO, which serves the Hudson Valley region. And while they're providing 27% of their properties receive services, there was a time where every single one of their properties received services, and they were able to do that through a pilot program from the New York State Department of Health Senior Supportive Housing Program. That said, when the pilot program ended, they sort of tried to manipulate their funding and were able to provide services for a few years before just realizing it wasn't feasible. And so as you see here, right, we see this recognition of knowing that services matter and knowing that it works, but just simply not knowing how to pay for it. When organizations are able to sort of reach this point of stability, I think that across the board, there's this opportunity for not only continuing to provide services, but also being able to grow and innovate. At the beginning of the summer, I spoke with the organization who has that $17.2 million budget, and their president shared with me that he really attributes their ability to grow as being able to raise money separate from property operations. And while the exact funding structure may differ by organizations, I just want to highlight here St. Mary Development Corporation, which has an incredibly diverse funding structure. It's almost a near even split between the property operating budget, private individual donors or corporations, the government, and development fees. And while I think that the 17% receiving services doesn't quite do them justice, because what they're doing is providing services across their board to where their senior residents are. And in order to now think, okay, well, how can we expand services across the portfolio? The focus has been on getting into the Pathways Hub network, where they'd be able to utilize Medicaid and Medicare dollars in order to sort of like reimburse and pay for services that they plan to offer across all of their properties. And lastly, I think it's just important to mention that when we talk about resident services, we're not only talking about, okay, well, how do organizations fund services? How do organizations deliver services? But on sort of like this end of the continuum, there's also this need to be monitoring and evaluating how services are being delivered. When I spoke with the CFO at Homeport, which is based in Columbus, Ohio, they're able to provide 100 services to every single one of their 43 properties. But she mentioned that even though they've sort of come up with like a very viable service model, they still need to contract out for the senior properties. And so as she mentioned in this quote here, they're realizing now that they need someone internally who has senior expertise. So in order to really assess what their partner is doing. And I think that maybe after this assessment, right, it's this question of, okay, well, do we continue to deliver service as this, or do we maybe bring as much in-house as we can? Just ending with one last quote that was shared with me earlier. Tejal Shah shared, "I don't know if there's any magic formula for figuring out funding for resident services. How do you fund for different services at different sites? How is it sustainable?" And when this was shared with me at the onset of my research, I really thought that my research would culminate with like the production of this magic formula. That said, I think that what my research really has illustrated for me is that this solution to like, whether we call it a formula or in general, this approach to resident services funding and delivery doesn't really rely on one model, but rather determining how to best position organizations to meet the needs of their residents and communities. That said, in terms of thinking about my own research's limitations and opportunities for future research, I think that there are several opportunities. The first being, this was a point in time survey that also occurred during the pandemic. And I think it would be really important to continue monitoring pandemic funding along with the overall pandemic's impact on organizations' approach to resident services and delivery across the board. I also think that I didn't have the opportunity to go on site and visit these organizations. And I think it would be really important to contextualize the work that organizations are doing in their actual communities and develop this deeper understanding of what that means for the rationale of services they provide and the funding that they're able to obtain. And then lastly, I think while this research does a really great job of establishing budgets and funding sources and has some insight into how organizations got there, I think a holistic inquiry into how resident services budgets are formed, especially including the role of residents, would provide a lot of insight as well. So that said, I want to take a moment again to thank everyone who came here today and give an additional thank you to Jennifer Malinsky and the support of the Joint Center for Housing Studies, Claire Rosenberger, along with the rest of her team at NeighborWorks, and of course, the organizations I spoke with and other people along the way who really made this research possible. Thank you.
Mel, thank you. And thank you for such a succinct overview. I know that, as we talked earlier, it's always challenging to shorten things. I'm wondering, a couple of interesting questions came in. And the first came from Megan Willella, a fellow, a MUP alum, who asked if you could speak a little bit more about what we know about the organizations that responded. In particular, how many affordable units did they have, and to what extent were they senior, family, Section 8, LIHTC, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think I'll say I have a lot of data, and it's taken a lot of willpower to figure out how to make it most succinctly in this time. So in terms of my focus, in terms of who the organization is right now, I just focused a lot on what percentage of properties were receiving services. But I think that, and my research didn't go into more of the bigger picture because of the data that exists already for NeighborWorks. And so there's a lot of pairings and crosstabs and work I can do and hope to do to better understand the full picture of the organization.
That leads me a little bit to a question I had, which also just came in on the Q&A, which is, can you talk a little bit about the motivation for the research? You could have researched many things, and I recall when this idea first came up, thinking about why is this so important? And it's not a topic. This is the first time I think any of the Gramlich Fellows had looked at this topic.
Yeah, I'll say, I think there's both the personal and the professional reason in terms of why, affordable housing nonprofits that own or manage rental housing, and then obviously that are within the NeighborWorks network. But I think a lot of that was dictated by, I think for the most part, it's a field, this comprehensive understanding really hasn't been established and isn't known. And so to try and get as both comprehensive, but accurate understanding of what it means to provide resident services. I spoke with someone early on it's an organization that doesn't have any rental properties, but they provide services to their community. So there was this question of, okay, well, is what we're doing providing services, or is it some sort of other community engagement opportunity? And so sort of to try and make it as clear as possible to get that succinct and accurate understanding of what the field is.
Interesting. My impression just from our conversations is in part because this isn't always baked into operating budgets, people, I think, is it fair to say that people see the need and then really, in a sense, scramble to figure out how to fund it?
Yeah.
Again, related on this thread that also just came in, do you have a sense, I don't know if it's from your data or just from now your kind of deep dive in the field, as to how operators, people interested in providing resident services can demonstrate, particularly through data, that this is a good investment, that this is worth either baking into the budget or providing separate money for?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of previous work that has shown what the return on investment is like for organizations that are doing resident services, whether maybe a good example there would be eviction prevention. By offering work within eviction prevention, what does that mean in terms of saving the organization money by not having, and also in the broader impact of not needing to evict folks, if that gets at what you're asking.
Yeah, there was a question here saying, did you run across any that measured health cost savings by offering?
Yeah, and I think that speaks to St. Mary Development Corporation, right, and their work in terms of getting into the Pathways Hub network. And I think that there is this sort of new avenue for a new discussions of, well, if these savings exist, then what are networks and models that would utilize that savings and sort of utilize Medicaid and Medicare dollars in order to pay for services upfront.
Mm-hmm. And a last question, at least for now, really about COVID and how did you get, again, you were doing a snapshot in time, but some thoughts on how COVID affected this, and in particular, did you run across any examples of people using teleservices in a new way?
Yeah, and I think we see that directly and indirectly. So going back to the service areas, when we see, and it would be interesting to compare that to previous years and see what organizations were doing, right? Was eviction prevention always the leading avenue, and were child development services always a lesser of a focus? But I think the most explicit was, right, my conversation with Wyndham and Windsor Housing Trust, where they're an organization that were only providing services to like a quarter of their properties. And with the pandemic, so much budget and funding flexibility enabled them to totally like revamp and reinvent their model.
Well, this is terrific, and I'd love to go on, but I also want to make sure we leave enough time for our second presentation. I'd just say that, you know, reflecting back, this was a wonderful example. Mel applied and had a particular interest in things like service delivery, and it turned out that within NeighborWorks, there was a great interest in really having some work done in this area. So it was a wonderful match, a terrific research. I would tell folks in this case, and also for Sharon, to stay tuned for watch the Joint Center website. Mel will be writing up her results and publishing it as a working paper, and there'll be a blog that accompanies that. Mel, thanks, and we may bring you back at the end. Sharon, it's all yours to change focus, change subjects, which in and of itself, I think tells us. I think that tells us something about the fellowship.
Very different subject, but related. Okay, are my slides good?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Okay, hi everyone, thanks for coming today. I'm going to talk about research I did over the summer on participatory models in housing with Native communities. And I was specifically looking at housing models for ownership as opposed to rental on tribal lands in the Southwest. As David mentioned, I'm a Master's of Architecture and Master's of Design Studies student. And in my research, I'm really interested in how design can more effectively meet community need. So for the purpose of this research, I started out being really interested in the role historically of participatory design in Native affordable housing projects, and then potentials for what participatory design could do in that space. In addition, I was interested in what role design can play in uplifting Native communities. And while I came into this interested in design, also as I was looking at affordable housing, I ended up learning a lot and looking a lot too at policy and financing and labor structures, which I'll share a little bit about today. The research that I did was interview-based and site visit-based. So I talked with organizations around the US specifically that worked in Native housing. And today I'm going to talk just about two case studies of site visits I did, one that's located in New Mexico that works with the Navajo Nation, and then one that's actually located on the US-Mexico border in Brownsville, Texas. Just to give a little bit of background about where housing policy is right now in terms of Native affordable housing specifically, it's been described, and I describe it as well, as this incomplete shifting towards self-determination. So we've seen over the past 30, 50 years that there's really been attempts to create policy that starts shifting power back to tribes through giving them more agency and how they use funding, for example. But one of the things that was expressed in the work I was doing was that there's a lot of contradiction in terms of the stated goals of policies, such as Nahasda's as an example, versus how they actually play out when they're being used on the ground. One of those is that there's so many federal regulations around how this funding can be used that tribes were finding that they were having to align their projects with federal regulations instead of being able to do the project in the way that they knew would be best for the community that they were working with. The second is that a lot of this funding and financial products doesn't necessarily always reach tribal lands and tribal people that it's meant to reach. So an example of that is Section 184 loans are loan products for people living on tribal lands because traditional banks often won't lend to them, and only maximum 13% of those are actually being used on reservations. So you see this history of restrictive financing, policy that's not quite effective, combined with generations of discrimination against Native people that has led to these pretty dire situations in which there's very urgent need for housing on tribal lands most of the time. So we often see high rates of poverty, issues with access to infrastructure, especially water and heating, and issues with overcrowding, and with those problems with health and sanitation. It's estimated that there's between 68,000 and 200,000 new units needed, although a lot say that estimate is pretty low. So when we're talking about tribal lands, you'll often see things such as this: manufactured homes that have been added on to over time are in various states of decay. And in addition, over the past 50 years, federal housing projects have often been built at a really low quality. So this is an example of a project I saw that this is a whole neighborhood of these houses that started deteriorating within a couple of years of being built. And this type of intervention that's taken place really has perpetuated this cycle of poverty and lack of access to housing, because it creates housing that might be affordable to get a family into immediately, but that falls apart pretty quickly. In addition, a lot of federal housing projects on tribal lands go unoccupied because they're either built at such low quality or designed so poorly that families actually don't want to move into them, even if there is a need. And the last thing is that federal housing projects have a history of not being responsive to cultural contexts. So this is an example of a project that was done in Alaska for an Indigenous family. And you can see this little space here. I hope you can see my mouse, that was added on by the family. And this was them expanding their Arctic entry, which is the space in front of the main entrance to the house that helps keep heat in the house. But also traditionally, it's a space that's really important for preparing food and for having funeral ceremonies when a loved one dies. So in this case, since the model of housing didn't take this into account, the family added this on. And this is just an important note about native design, and what native design means and can mean is that native design doesn't have to be like a teepee or use native materials. A lot of times in the work I was looking at, it was really about a sensitivity to the layout and use of space, and that playing a role in the design of these housing projects. So years of policies, financing, and projects like the one we just saw have really created a concept around what native housing is thought to look like and to be able to look like. This is just an anecdote from my research. So this is a project that's being done on the Navajo Nation. You can see it has two buildings that are meant to be like gathering spaces. One is a more traditional hogan, and then the other is this structure that, to me, when I first saw it, really looked like a manufactured home. And when I spoke to the person who had worked on designing these and asked why they had chosen this specific design for this yellow building, they said that it was because they wanted like a simple structure, a very simple building. And so you see in this example kind of this conflation of like what a default building looks like with a manufactured home, which is the type of housing that's most prevalent on the Navajo Nation. And from my research and some of the things I just shared, one thing became really clear, which was that when you're thinking about affordable housing for Native communities, that you can't just build any house, that a house really needs to be two things. That a home needs to be an asset. So thinking about an asset both as a safe and stable place to live, and also a space that maintains financially its value over time by not deteriorating. And second, that a home really needs to create pride as a way to start to shift this conditioned mindset around housing and what housing can be. So I want to shift now to look at two case studies. The really great part about this research was that I got to learn about these issues, but also talk with and learn about all these models that are working to solve some of these issues. I'm going to share two of those, like I said. The first is the Native Partnership for Housing. This is an organization that's located in New Mexico, works with the Navajo Nation, and they focus on creating high quality housing that will last over time. The Navajo Nation is a huge swath of land. You'll often see a lot of open landscape with homes, manufactured homes and hogan structures dotted around. They have a lot of issues specifically with access to water just because of how the land is. So you'll see something like this. You might see self-built homes such as this, and they have a history of these federal projects that have deteriorated very quickly over time. Here's an example of one. This is an example of another. So given this context, MPH really believes that the greatest issue on the Navajo Nation is a lack of access to middle income housing and jobs, because they believe that all of the talent that could stay at the Navajo Nation is being pulled away because there isn't housing that middle income residents want to live in. So they focus on, and I think, actually, never mind, I'll bring that up later. But so they focus on building homes that are accessible to middle income, but also low income residents. And I want to look specifically at this model this project that they're working on called Kerrigan Estates. This is a subdivision on the Navajo Nation. And like I said, they focus on high quality construction and also resident involvement in their model. I'm just going to talk about financing, design, and labor in this model. First, financing. They use private money for construction, and this is to avoid the complexities of federal regulations that I talked about earlier that come with using federal funding. They use federal money not for construction, but instead for down payment and loan assistance so that low-income families are able to move into these homes. And to them, I think it's really important that their home, the cost of building one of their homes, this is an example, this is a 4-bedroom house, is often equivalent to some of these lower quality federal projects that happen. So you can see these are units that were recently built. They're modular, very small, and since they were built recently, it's yet to be seen what will happen with them, but given the type of construction, it's likely that they will again deteriorate as many of the other projects have. Second, in the design of their homes, MPH incorporates resident choice as a way to create pride and a sense of ownership over the home. So the way they do that is that residents get to choose between 3 models for what the home looks like, and within that model that they choose, they decide what the house is going to look like on the exterior, and then they also have the ability to enlarge, add spaces onto the home, choose what certain places, if we're looking at certain spaces, if we're looking at this plan, end up being in the home. And this creates spaces, so this is the Kerrigan Estates, where there's slight differences in style and layout in the homes, but more importantly than that, where the residents have a certain level of pride and attachment to their homes. This is something that's been really important for NPH in terms of what they've observed with the families that move into these areas. I think one thing that's important to note is these have what we would consider like a very suburban aesthetic, but the reason for that is that residents have actually asked for this, especially because a lot of them have gone and lived elsewhere. And then when they come back to the Navajo Nation, they want to be able to live in a home like this. And the third and final piece is their labor structure. So NPH has a subsidiary construction company that hires all Navajo labor, and this is our Navajo workers. And this is a way to build wealth in the community and also create stability for the employees because they have consistent work and also benefits. This is just an example of one of their work sites. And in conclusion, I think in NPH's model, the things that were most exciting is that they really focus on building high quality up front and also in incorporating residents into the process of design as a way to create a home that will last long term, where the value remains stable, and also to create this sense of pride in the home. The second case study I want to look at is an organization called Come Dream, Come Build, CDCB. They're actually located in Texas. And the reason I'm talking about them is because they have a model called Mi Casita that right now they're working on using with Native communities. And that's the model I'm going to talk about, the Mi Casita model. They are focused on quality in construction, but also on meeting immediate need and lowering barrier to entry to getting families into homes. The areas that they've worked in are in colonias, which are primarily low-income Latino neighborhoods that are defined by a mix of types of housing. So in a colonia, you might see something like this, manufactured homes in various states of repair and disrepair. You might see something like this that has a permanent foundation but is falling apart. Or you might see a home like this, which I think we would consider to be more durable construction. And this is the reason colonias have this mix is because residents build incrementally. So as a family's wealth increases over time, they will move from a manufactured home to something like this. As I mentioned, I'm going to talk about a model called Mi Casita. And in that model, CDCB actually uses this idea of incremental building. Like I said, they believe that the greatest issue in housing in the communities they work in, and also with Native communities, is that there's a really high barrier to entry for home ownership that can be very difficult for low-income residents to surpass. Shifting to the Mi Casita model, so in terms of financing, they're franchising this model so that Native communities have access to it. It's also, like I said, a prefabricated unit. So it's the way it's being manufactured, it'll be 20% cheaper than a stick-built model. And they, like NPH2, are focusing on getting private funding for this so that they're not beholden to federal regulation. Second, in the design. So the design is made to be expanded over time. So you can see it starts with this prefabricated unit, and I say prefabricated, but something important about this model is that it's not it's at a higher quality than what we would consider like a manufactured homes quality to be at. But the model starts with this type of unit, which a family can afford. And then over time, they're able to add on more modules to this unit as their family and wealth grows. And so this incorporates, first of all, lowering barrier to entry in the sense that it has this lower cost unit at the beginning, but also resident choice in the sense that residents choose what type of module is added on over time, and what type of like porch structure is added on. And this is much like MPH, the idea behind this is that choice creates pride in the home, and that this allows for low income residents to move into homes. I think there's a question in their model of aesthetics. This is what a lot of their homes look like. And one thing they're working on now is figuring out, when they're working within Native communities with this Mi Casita model, what can be standardized across this versus what needs to be able to respond to specificities of culture. Lastly, their labor, they're also looking at local manufacture and assembly in order to build wealth within the communities where this housing is going in. In conclusion, their model really includes building at a higher quality, but more so than that, building incrementally as a way to lower barrier to entry for residents that need to move into these homes, and also incorporating, like NPH, resident choice as a way to create a sense of ownership over these homes. To start to conclude and to move back to this question of design that I started with, while I began looking at policy and other elements, thinking specifically about what the role of design can play in Native affordable housing projects, there were three really important conclusions. The first is that design has to create new visions for what Native housing can look like as a way to start to shift this mindset around housing that's been conditioned by history and by housing projects that exist. Second, that housing models need to understand local identity and context in the way that makes sense. And oftentimes that ends up being in terms of layout and sensitivity to use of spaces. And then third, that it was really important in all the models I looked at that residents were able to be involved in the decision-making process around how their home would be designed as a way to create a sense of pride and ownership and attachment to the home and to the community. Lastly, to conclude, more specifically thinking about pathways forward in terms of the three elements I talked about, financing, design, and labor, things that became really clear were that federal policies need to shift to be less restrictive, and that they need to focus in terms of affordability as well, not so much on cutting costs at the beginning, but on thinking about the long-term trajectory of the home. Second, in terms of design, that because of urgent need, housing developments need to both be able to meet urgent need, but also to address the long-term issues around housing, to start to shift what the housing landscape looks like. And one of the ways I saw that done was through like an MPH's model, building at higher quality so that the home would last. And third, in terms of labor, labor should bring wealth into the community wherever possible. So a lot of the models that, when I was doing this research, it was really exciting because there's so many models that have popped up that have, the sad part is that they're trying to fill these gaps that the government and federal policies are leaving. But I think there's a lot of possibility in terms of models I looked at and moving forward of housing to start to be able to kind of meet this urgent need because of the situations on tribal lands, but also to start to create long-term stability and prosperity for Native communities. I'm going to conclude there. Anyone feel free to email me if you have any questions about my work or the fellowship. And I also just want to end saying thank you to the Joint Center and NeighborWorks and my mentors at both of those places, and also to all the people who let me interview with them, because this can be a really sensitive topic, and there were a lot of people who took a lot of time to talk with me. Thank you.
Sharon, thank you. Really, whoops, my video on now? Is my video on?
I can't see it.
Where am I? Let's try that. There we go. Couple of really interesting questions here, starting with someone asking, were there any special attention paid to or accommodations made for elderly in the design? And I would expand that out, other people who might have, mobility issues, kind of making sure that those issues got addressed.
Yeah, I didn't focus as much on access for people with disabilities and for the elderly, but I know that a lot of these models, because of the way that the plans need to get approved, that a lot of them already include accessibility. So like the MPH homes all include accessibility measures, and in those homes it was interesting because a lot of them there's like 3 to 4 generations living. So it'll be like the grandparents, the parents, the kids, sometimes the great grandparents as well. I think something around cultural sensitivity too that these housing models, some of the housing models I looked at incorporated was that a lot of times in tribal communities there's generations of the family living together, so that the homes need to take that into account in order for the family to be able to live there.
We have a bunch of questions kind of around this quality and cost issue. And maybe to start with, do you have a sense that the modular homes, I assume in this case from your second case, of what they think the cost of those would be? And I guess related to that, same person asked, how are they defining high quality construction?
Yeah, I think, affordability or the financing is always an issue. They did tell me, I don't remember exactly how much that model was going to cost. If the person who wrote that wants to put their email into the Q&A, I can follow up on that. And then the second question was
the second question, and there's a couple different versions of this about how do we think about quality. Manufactured housing doesn't necessarily have to be poor quality.
Yeah.
And so is it possible to do, manufactured housing in a way, I guess, in part, that would provide the kind of quality that you're talking about?
Definitely, and that's what CDCB is working on, and they work with an architect called BC Workshop, and they're the Mi Casita model is interesting because I think it has a lot of potential, but it's still in process. So they're actually working on testing different types of manufacturing, because I think also in terms of affordability and quality, one of the things and the differences of these two models is NPH creates homes that are meant to last 100 years, but they build very slowly. Like they can't build a lot of units in a year, versus CDCB still wants to create something high quality, but in a different way, by creating a prefabricated unit so that they can also meet more need more quickly, because there's so many issues around housing.
Very, very interesting point here. Someone notes that in New Mexico, the median household income is just south of $32,000, and you're looking at a $400,000 house, and trying to jibe that.
Yeah.
How do we think about this as a sustainable answer? And I think I know part of the answer just from having talked with you about this, but go ahead.
Yeah, part of it I think is built into NPH's financing model. So when I mentioned about the fact that they use federal funding to get down payment and loan assistance so that families can move in, they also, I didn't mention this, but the organization I talked to also have extensive financial education that residents are required to take part in order to move into these homes. And the reason for that is, first of all, to make sure the family can actually move into this home and finance that, but also so that they're able to maintain the home over time, and have finances to do that. So a lot of families, after going through that, are actually able to afford these homes. But like I said, in the MPH model, they both sell at market rate to more middle income families who can afford it, and they also find federal subsidies in order to move lower income residents in.
Couple of questions here about financing, and the extent to which, and you started to touch on this, that were there any other particularly interesting financing mechanisms or roles of some bank grant programs in some of these?
Yeah, they all of the ones I looked at had different financing mechanisms. They were mostly focused on like figuring out how to move away from having to use federal funding. So CDCB, that's kind of in process. NPH, they've totally done that through getting private donations in order to do this. There were other ones, like I looked at the models of some of the pueblos in New Mexico that I didn't mention here, where they're right now using federal funding, but they're really trying to figure out how to find better ways to invest the money they have so that they can move away again from using federal funding in this attempts to push towards having more agency and how they're able to build homes.
And I'm gonna get back to your roots in as a design student in design studies and architecture. Really interesting question here says, were there any master planning dimension to these projects? I mean, some of these did look like they were not just one-offs, and wondering how those processes worked and were the same kind of, let's leave it at that. Were there master planning dimension to these?
Yeah, there were master planning in some of them. So an example was I looked at the Pueblo of Jemez in New Mexico, and they're a project they're working on called Pueblo Place is like a new subdivision with affordable housing units. And that was interesting because one of their greatest issues is that it's a really small pueblo and they're actually just running out of space to put homes. But culturally, it doesn't quite make sense to like start to build up. So they're trying to figure out how they can fit more homes into the limited space they have. So in that sense, there's a lot of master planning going on in terms of where they can start to put new subdivisions and how they can start to divide up space. In addition, in a lot of the areas I looked at, water is a big issue. And so like at the Pueblo of Jemez, there was a lot of looking at how to bring water infrastructure to these areas. And also with that project, there was a dimension of like property ownership. Like property ownership doesn't work the same way, so it won't be clear who owns land, and so there'll be a lot of issues in terms of like residents and also the tribal government not taking responsibility for improving infrastructure in certain areas because there's no like piece of paper that says who owns it. So I think the Pueblo of Jemez Housing Authority is starting to try to figure out how to deal with some of those issues too.
Mel, if I can bring you back just for a couple of final wrap-up questions, one of which was spurred by Sharon's presentation. Sharon, you made a very big deal of this point about consulting with residents.
Yes.
And it made me wonder, Mel, if you've got any sense of to what extent are residents being consulted in the design of resident service programs?
Yeah, that's sort of related to like my last point of like my limitation and recommendations for future research. Like it's something I didn't hear about, and I would love to know, like with budgets in general, like are residents involved in the budget formulation process at all in terms of whether that's asking for certain services or allocating money otherwise. So definitely something I'm interested in, but can't really speak to.
I want to take just a couple of our last minutes here for a second to ask you both kind of a question about the fellowship, because part of the main point of this is for you to get to share some wonderful research, but also to spur interest among the next cohort of Gramlich Fellows. And I'm wondering what advice each of you have for people who might be thinking about this fellowship in terms of both what works and what are going to be some of the challenges that people should be prepared for.
Mel, go for it. I'll go after you.
All right. I think something I've been reflecting on is that if you have a question that you're really that you're excited to address, I think that this fellowship gives such unique access to a network of organizations and professionals who are doing on the ground work. And Sharon got I think really, well, maybe I'll turn it over to Sharon, but I think whether that's for me was just like the unique experience to have access to folks and get to learn more about their work. I don't think I could have really gotten that wide range otherwise.
Yeah, I think expanding exactly on what you said, Mel, I think the Gramlich is a super awesome experience because it gives you the chance to do an independent research within a structure where you have a lot of support. So like we get a mentor from the Joint Center for Housing Studies, from the partner organization NeighborWorks. And then your mentor at NeighborWorks is connected to the whole NeighborWorks network, which is enormous, and throughout the entire US. So like you said, Mel, if there's like a question you want to start exploring less through like working maybe a traditional internship and want to actually be able to be on the ground talking to people, seeing the type of work they're doing, this is just an awesome experience for that. And I've done a lot of like research related fellowships in the past, and this is probably the best one I've done in terms of the structure really being able to set up for the fellows to succeed in what they're doing.
We did not plant that answer. I just thought.
Yeah, not planned. I also never told you that, David, but that's
true. That's true. I should have written it down. We can put it. We can. And then finally, just to go back to kind of the wonderful world of research. I mean, both of you went into your projects with some knowledge of what you were doing, and in both cases, I think great passion for the subject. But I'm wondering, as you reflect now, you're sort of bringing the fellowship to a close. What turned out for you? What was particularly surprising in what you learned? What didn't confirm to your expectations, and then what also has kind of come to strike you as particularly important about this subject? So if hypothetically you had the HUD secretary for 30 seconds in an elevator at GSD, and you wanted her to know one thing about your work, what what would it be? So what surprised you, or what's particularly important that you want us to walk away with?
Do you want to start us off, Sharon?
Sure. I see you're prepping us, David, for the the visit next week. I think so. You mentioned I had experience. I had a lot of experience working in participatory design spaces and analyzing those processes and creating those processes. I didn't have really any experience looking at Native communities. So I think something that was really surprising to me was just one, just in terms of design education, like what we don't talk about that design can do, and like the types of spaces we don't talk about, like thinking about housing development in Native communities. There's so much need there, and I think it's like a subject that needs to be talked about way more. I think also something that was just exciting about my research was how many really amazing like people are working on these issues, and models that exist that have already done so much and have a lot of potential. And I think the final thing that was surprising to me, but is becoming less so in like the academic research I'm doing, is just the difference between the reality of how these organizations are working on the ground and what they know to be true based on being part of these communities and working within these communities, versus like the mismatch with policy and like support that the government wants to be able to give but isn't like providing effectively. I think that was really surprising to me.
Yeah, for me, I think it affirmed the importance and potential of resident services. That said, I think that while there are so many funding opportunities out there for organizations to obtain, it takes a lot of work to know what's out there and to be able to obtain that funding. And so in particular, in thinking about being in the elevator with someone with a lot of policy control, I think we approach, there's so many avenues for affordable housing, especially at the federal level, but sort of questioning like, okay, well, what is out there for resident services across the board, not just with like specific populations, and maybe better understanding how we can cast a wider funding net to truly make resident services just as important as the operations of affordable housing in general.
Well, I want to thank both of you. I was found myself thinking I didn't know Ned Gramlich, who is the namesake of the fellowship, but I've read a lot of his work, and for me he's a really important figure because he's one of those people who was a terrific academic, but also was very rooted in the real world of policy. He was on the NeighborWorks board. The NeighborWorks boardroom itself is named after him. And his writings are very clear about making the translation between those worlds. And that's really at the heart of the Gramlich Fellowship. I can't recall if I said this in my opening remarks, but I think the work that both of you did is just exemplars of what we want and hope for the fellowship. You took on subjects that haven't gotten as much attention as they deserve. They're clearly important. You did wonderful work, and you've presented it really clearly. I'm looking forward to seeing the final versions of your papers, and I would encourage those of you who are on today's event to make sure you're on our list so that you'll see the write-ups. As Mel and Sharon have both indicated, there's much more that we didn't give them time to say, but for the moment, I hope everybody will join me, at least virtually, in thanking you for just terrific presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.